get some later. So you can go home with them and take a look, okay? Okay? We're Christians, we can share, right? Jesus said something about that, I think. Actually, yeah. So, all right. This gives you a sampling of different ancient authors, of people that we have that have existed that have survived from the ancient world until now, right? Plato, Homer, Herodotus, Aristotle, Thucydides, Aristophanes, Sophocles, Julius Caesar, Tacitus, Pliny, Suetonius, and others. Now, their literary works. There's some sampling of the literary works. The next column, the date in which they actually wrote what they wrote. Okay, 4th century, 9th century. These are all BC, right? Or the later ones are AD. The earliest copy we have of their writings. So, for example, Plato wrote his dialogues in the 4th century BC. The earliest copy we have of his writings is when? 900 AD. What's the difference between the time he actually wrote it and the time of the earliest surviving copy? 1,300 years. Wow, that's quite a gap, isn't it? Could there not have been changes and distortions in 1,300 years? Possibly, right? And yet scholars are pretty certain they know what he wrote. All right? So, how many copies do we have of what he wrote? 20. And that's the earliest is 900 AD. The other ones are there and afterwards, okay? That's a huge gap. And going down that chart, you can see there the kind of weight of evidence for these ancient writings that are the foundation of a lot of modern historical study of the ancient world, okay? Now, let's compare that to the New Testament. It's not even close, right? When it comes to the New Testament manuscripts, we have, now this chart here says 5,600 plus. Every year they're finding more. We now have over 5,700 manuscripts of the New Testament, in whole or in part, from the earliest centuries. They date from, well, very early in the 2nd century, the oldest ones, and you're dealing here within a generation of Jesus. Not 1,300 year gaps, but one generation. Wow, okay? 5,700 Greek manuscripts. The New Testament was written in what language, folks? Greek. Maybe big enough hint, didn't I? Okay. Now, let me ask you this. Are we dependent on the Greek manuscripts to know what the Greek New Testament was? What it said about Jesus? No. If someone was able to round up every single copy of the New Testament in Greek and burn it tomorrow, okay? Not possible. Let's just say it happened, all right? They just disappeared off the earth. Would we be able to know what Jesus said and did? Actually, yes, because we have over 10,000 Latin manuscripts of the New Testament and over 10,000 other versions. We call them versions, but what that means is they are manuscripts, early manuscripts of the New Testament in Gothic, Aramean, Coptic, which is Egyptian language, okay? Ethiopic, can you guess where that's from? Okay. Syriac, which is Western Aramaic, not to be confused with Arabic, okay folks, different language, etc., etc. We have dozens of different languages that have early copies. Overall, over 10,000 of those besides the 10,000 Latin. So over 20,000 manuscripts in other languages even besides the Greek. Okay? How does it compare with our Plato here with 20 copies? Okay? Now, if all those copies were to disappear and you didn't have any copy of the New Testament in any language, would we know what Jesus said? Surprisingly, the answer is still yes. Why? You see, who can tell what the church fathers are? You should all know this, by the way, if you don't. Who are the church fathers? Not by name necessarily, I don't want to list here. But who are the church fathers? That's a technical term, really. Okay, what is it? What's the church fathers? No? Blank looks? No. Help me out here. Pardon? Priests? Not necessarily. We're talking here about the next generation of believers after the apostles. Okay? So the church fathers are, what happened after the apostles died? Did they leave nothing behind them? Of course. They had disciples, people who learned from at their feet. Right? They learned at the feet of Jesus, and then when they went out and taught, what happened? People sat at their feet and learn. And we have people, we have their writings, the writings of the disciples have come down to us. That's what we call the Church Fathers. And they go from the late 1st century all the way up till, well, 5, 6 centuries after we still call them the Church Fathers. These people, when they wrote to each other and they wrote to the churches, they quoted the Scriptures time and time again. Huge passages. Do you know what? If you went to a church in, say, Corinth or Thessalonica or in Spain somewhere, do you think you would have a nice copy of the Bible sitting there to read? Nope. Do you know why? Well, first of all, the Bible hasn't been completed yet in the early centuries of the church. But besides that, of course, people couldn't afford it, and everything had to be done by hand. So you would have a chest. I can't remember the technical term for that chest, but you would have in it scrolls. Okay? And later on, you would have codices. Codices. You know what those are? Books. Okay? Do you know who invented, most likely who invented books? That new technology? The Christian church. As they said, we need a convenient way to compile the writings about Jesus and make them available to people. They changed the technology, going from papyrus scrolls to books. Imagine that. Wow. Now we've gone from books to computers, but back then that was a big technological development back then. And so they would have these boxes with scrolls and codices, books in them. And they would have maybe one gospel plus some of the letters of Paul. Neighboring church would have some other letters of Paul and maybe another gospel. This is how it went, okay? So they'd have these books. Now, where was I here? Okay, so the church fathers, they would write and quote from these people in huge passages and send them to the churches, send them to one another. We have their writings. So if every manuscript of the Bible, of the New Testament, was destroyed overnight, whatever language, we'd have the quotations of the church fathers of the Bible, and we'd be able to reconstruct almost all the New Testament simply from the quotations found in the church fathers. Do you know how many quotations? Does it actually say here? It doesn't say here. Good. I'll tell you something you don't know right in front of you. Okay. Over 1 million and counting. Over 1 million and counting quotations of the New Testament in the early church fathers. And that allows us to simply go and say, hey, you know what? We know what Jesus said, but again, it was preserved far and wide in multiple languages and copies and quotations, all spread out all over the ancient world. Okay? Dating from the earliest centuries, that makes all those other ancient works pale by comparison. And so there's a science called, here's another term for you to know, textual criticism. Do you know what textual criticism is? I'll give you a definition here. Part of it, partly. Textual criticism, it says, is not criticizing, just like apologetics is not about apologizing. Okay? That much you'll have clear before you leave here today. Okay? Textual criticism is looking at, because you know what, I'll tell you this, there's thousands and thousands of manuscripts in different languages, but when you compare them, you realize that they're not all quite the same. There's little differences in spelling. Sometimes a word is different here and there, and you say, oh, wait a minute here. How do we know that we actually have the words in the original? Textual criticism is this. It's a science that sits down and looks and compares all the thousands of different copies and compares copy with copy to arrive by well-known established principles what the original writer wrote. You follow me here? But arriving at the original writing of the first, what they call the autographs. It's not a signature. It means a copy first written by Peter, by Matthew, by Luke, by Mark, and so forth. They call them autographs. And so textual criticism is reconstructing the autographs by looking at the thousands and thousands of different copies of the New Testament in Greek and Ethiopic and Latin and as quoted in the Church Fathers and so on. Do you follow me? Okay. Questions so far on that? If I left you in the dust, confused, perplexed. Okay, move on then. Right now. When people tell you that you cannot know what the Bible, the original Bible was, you can say nonsense. There's a science called textual criticism that allows us, with all the thousands and thousands of copies we have, to arrive at what